Simply put, my approach is to deny Israel's defenders their terms of debate. In my view, we have all along been waging our defense on their terms. Even the fact that we need to ask this question is extraordinary, because the injustice has been ongoing right in front of the world's eyes for more than a century, and yet today we can't even blurt out what's right in front of everybody's eyes without worrying about the repercussions in this, our allegedly free society with its supposedly free press. So for the experiment, I'd like to take a step back, as if approaching this question as a simple problem-solving exercise. The problem, we analyze it, we get a solution, free of any previous assumptions as best as we can. And to begin, I'd like to tell a quick story, a true story. A few years ago, in response to some talks that I had given, including the one here, the Zionist media labeled me a hate speaker, as it did to anyone challenging Israel. In my case, it was for saying that the Zionist movement conducted a wave of terrorism in the 1940s to force the establishment of the Israeli state. But then came a very strange twist. Two of these newspapers, the Jewish Chronicle and Haaretz, now carried an astonishing news scoop. They reported that in the 1940s, the Zionist movement waged a campaign of terror to create the Israeli state. Their source, two of the many British documents that I had already used and cited in far greater detail. So, why did they publish and pretend to have discovered what they had smeared me for documenting? Reading the articles, the answer was clear. Since this history could no longer be buried, history had to be co-opted. It had to be subsumed into Zionist mythology. That is to say, it had to be turned into a narrative. And so what the documents really revealed was, as the Jewish Chronicle put it, quote, "A blood-soaked struggle for Israel's future. Acrobatics re-narrated Zionist pre-state terrorism as an unwanted burden thrust upon an Israel that did not yet exist. Through narrative, Zionism's crimes became Israel's suffering." That incident is a microcosm of Israel's great weapon, its grand narrative, without which all its weapons of steel would be impotent. And so it is essential that we dissect Israel's narrative and expose it naked for all to see beyond its purveyor's ability to re-narrate it. Naturally, all nation-states have their mythology, their national narrative, especially settler states like the one I'm from on the other side of the Atlantic, and all should be challenged. But Israel's is unique both in its nature and its power, of which Western nations repressing their own citizens, us, on behalf of that foreign nation, is but one aspect. So let's begin by asking, what is the nature of this problem we're trying to solve? Well, if we look to see what's happening, we see the seizure of land by force. We see the forcible expulsion of people due to their ethnicity. We see a system of suppression by ethnicity. We see the erasure of the existence of the wrong ethnicity through the destruction or rebranding of their presence, and the theft of their cultural iconography, whether through its erasure or expropriation. And finally, we see the systematic dehumanization of the wrong people in order to justify the crimes against them. Now that we've identified the problem, does it match the words normally used to encapsulate the problem? This would seem to be step one. Well, there would seem to be three words used: the ubiquitous term conflict, the word occupation, and the word apartheid. What do these words tell the public? Well, conflict tells the public that this is a disagreement to be negotiated between two equally empowered and legitimate interests. But what we see are not disagreements, they are crimes by a powerful group against a defenseless group. The word conflict is a misdiagnosis that has served Israel well, enabling it to continue its crimes and allowing the media to present the public the fallacy of two equal sides to this. The next term, occupation, is of course the common keyword used by many people fighting for justice in Palestine, the cure thus being to end the occupation. But despite the fact that Israel's defenders claim not to like the word, it too is a dangerous misunderstanding of the crime, and like the word conflict, in my view, only benefits Israel's systematic oppression of Palestinians. If we ask, what is his occupation? Well, we think of it as being geographic, and so let's take the most inclusive definition normally used. Everything on the Palestinian side of the armistice line, the so-called 67 borders. That is to say, the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, Gaza, and of course separately Syria's Golan Heights. So let's follow this to its logical conclusion. Let's say that the pro-Palestinian chants of end the occupation suddenly were answered. Israel pulled completely out of the land beyond the armistice line. Well, it would be a very sorry morning after, and we'd have forfeited the right to any further claim. We'd wake up to and be stuck with what? A dissected remnant of what was once Palestine, the refugees still blocked from returning to their homes on the Israeli side of the armistice line, which is most of the land, and race laws still awaiting them even if they did, apartheid in Israel unchanged for its non-Jewish population, a Palestinian Authority that exists only with the Israeli state's seal of approval, and we would not only have accepted the legitimacy of the disastrous 1947 UN partition that was shoved through under US pressure, but at the same time accepted Israel's right alone to disregard it. Contrary to the term 67 borders, the armistice line was explicitly not a border, but a ceasefire line and nothing more, orphaning more than half of the land the UN had given to the Palestinians onto the Israeli side. Israel was supposed to return to its legal borders or some other mutually agreed alternative, but simply refused. Now, if we say that at this point in time it's too late to undo, well, yes, that was the idea. That has been the method for everything Israel has done. It is a river-to-sea annexation, not occupation. It is an occupation of a people, not of land. Israel's feigning outrage at the word occupation takes us off the scent of its actual crimes, and instead keeps our noses on a decoy goal that cannot lead to Palestinian liberation. So we need to call it what it is: apartheid, and apartheid's most extreme results, ethnic cleansing and ethnic executions. Apartheid was imposed on Palestine by the British on behalf of the Zionist settlers over a century ago and has remained the state of the land ever since. But what does that mean? Who is perpetrating apartheid on whom? If we look to see who is the doer of this apartheid, what we see matches what we're told. It is the Israeli state. But when we look to identify the victim of this apartheid, the defining factor that determines whether someone will be master or slave, we see that it does not match what we're told. We're told that the victims are the Palestinians or the Arabs, but this is not just obviously wrong. The lie is fundamental to Israel's grand narrative, and yet we have been mindlessly repeating it on Israel's behalf. What condemns the victims to apartheid is not that they are Palestinian, not that they are Arab, it is solely that they are not Jewish. Palestinian Arab Jews were always part of the fabric of Palestinian civilization, until the arrival of the Zionists. Jewish Palestinian Arabs were welcomed by the Zionists because they were Jewish, while all the other Palestinian Arabs became the oppressed because they were not. That and nothing else is why Israel has condemned millions of human beings to various levels of apartheid, and why it keeps millions more languishing in refugee camps. If they were Jewish, whether Palestinian or Arab or anything else, they would be welcomed by Israel and given a generous subsidy to take over a house whose owner was expelled because he or she is not Jewish. Describing the situation as between Israel and the Palestinians, in my view, trivializes the crime into some real estate dispute and indeed provides the rhetorical gymnastics through which Israel denies it is an apartheid regime. But most importantly, wrongly identifying the object of the apartheid allows Zionism to obscure its exploitation of Jewish identity as a racial supremacist cult. Accurately identifying Zionism's victim exposes Zionism's crime against Jews. In my view, nothing in the history of Zionism, of the Israeli state, or the ongoing conflict can be understood without this front and center. This is a racial supremacist war by Zionists against non-Jews, river to sea, cynically perpetrated in the name of Jews. The Israeli state will exploit the term Jews and Jewish, for example, coercing news media to refer to West Bank apartheid settlements as Jewish neighborhoods or Jewish settlements, in order to plant the idea that if you're against them, it's because they're Jewish. But you will never hear the object of the apartheid referred to correctly as non-Jews. If the media were to report this accurately, the Zionist project would immediately become untenable, exposed as a racist outrage against Jews and non-Jews alike. Imagine the Great March of Return of a few years back, when people in Gaza made a purely symbolic show of returning to their own legal homes from which they were ethnically cleansed. Headlines would read something like this: people attempting to return home continue to be shot dead by Israeli snipers because they're not Jewish. There's nothing interpretive in that headline. It's a clear, straightforward statement of what is happening. We also need to freshly examine the perpetrator of the apartheid, the Israeli state. If I ask, what is Israel? I think most people would repeat what the state itself says it is, what the media says it is. It's the Jewish state. Now, we accept this term with little thought, but even on the obvious level, the term already creates a magic shield around Israel. How often have I, and I'm sure many of you here, heard, why are you always criticizing the Jewish state? So in order to disable this magic shield, we need to look inside to see what powers it. Under the hood, we see that the Jewish state is a stealth term that creates a messianic gateway to the public mind, sparking past any critical thought. There is an entire world of narrative hidden within those three words, the most powerful of which is the article, the. Israel does not claim to be merely a Jewish state in the sense of countries that have a national religion. Indeed, to quote Ben-Gurion, Israel has nothing to do with Judaism, but rather with, quote, being a Jew, Ben-Gurion's words, and nor with being just an Israeli Jew, but with the ethnicity itself. According to Israel's construct, it is the state of all Jews as Jews, free of national borders, and indeed free of any individual Jewish consent on the matter. And it is for this reason that Israel does not allow Israeli nationality for Jews. The nationality of Jewish citizens of Israel is, by Israeli law, Jewish. This nation-state adaptation of tribalism is the internal workings of its weapons of silencing critics through the smear of anti-Semitism. But it is also Zionism's fatal flaw. The premise that the state is a part of the DNA of an ethnic identity is unknown in the modern world, with two exceptions: Israel and common bigots. Racists blame individuals by virtue of some claimed oneness with some ethnicity or nationality or type. And so during the spread of COVID-19, Chinese-looking people were attacked because the virus came from China. They, the Chinese, caused COVID. This is classic, ignorant bigotry, and we all condemn it. Israel's magic shield works by doing precisely this to Jews, but turning it around in order to hold Jewish identity ransom to insulate its crimes. And instead of condemning it, we run in fear from it. We would say Israel did XYZ. A bigot would say the Jews did XYZ. But that bigot is now the Israeli state and its cheerleaders, who have made state and ethnicity synonymous in order to repackage criticism of the state as anti-Semitic. Other states deflect criticism of their crimes by hiding behind the flag, as we say, accusing dissenting citizens of being unpatriotic to the state. Israel hides behind the ethnicity, free of borders, accusing dissenting voices anywhere of being traitors to the ethnicity. For anyone from the larger Western tradition, and I include secular people, the name Israel exists apart from all other place names. Its very sound transcends the realm of the profane and touches a nerve deep within our collective cultural subconscious. It is a place rooted in Genesis itself, and Israel, the modern nation state, very openly exploits this to position itself as that place, and the land's ancient artifacts as the nation state's artifacts, and its settlers as that biblical land's people. Now, as laughable as this may and certainly should sound, its power is very real, and it is the reason the name was chosen. So in our problem-solving exercise, what can we do to drag the place name Israel back to the realm of the profane? At the very least, we should always use the term the Israeli state, never just Israel, unless you mean the place in the Bible. The Zionist use of Hebrew as the vernacular operates in tandem. Our association with that venerable ancient language is not just geographic, it is also temporal. It, too, is an artifact serving to place the Israeli state in a protected part of our collective psyche. Hebrew is exploited to tell our subconscious that the settler, fresh off the plain, moving into a West Bank outpost on ethnically cleansed land, is a native who has been there for 3,000 years. We can dampen the effect by referring to the language as modern Hebrew, which it is, quite distinct from the Hebrew of history. Okay, the court of public opinion might say, all this may be true, but nonetheless, Zionism and the Israeli state serve the dignity and safety of Jews. That's what they're all about. This is where history is so vital. History can clear the fog of propaganda from our eyes, pull the facade off Israel's invisible armor, its narrative. The historical record makes clear that the actual goal of the Zionist movement, its driving force, was not Jewish safety and dignity, but rather the Zionist state itself at the expense of Jewish safety and dignity. Anti-Jewish bigotry and violence were and remain its fuel, its reason to exist that it must forever reinvent. And this is why Israel's defenders, while smearing anti-racists as anti-Semitic, embrace true anti-Jewish bigots and even neo-fascists. During the terrible years of the late 1930s through to the end of the Second World War, Zionist leaders fought against safe haven for Jews unless that safe haven was in Palestine. It was not simply a matter of not pursuing safe haven anywhere in safe countries, which would already have been pretty damning, but actually blocking it. If Jews started finding safety and dignity elsewhere, it would lay bare Zionism's great lie, its reason to exist. I'll cite one particularly clear example from late 1942 during the height of the Holocaust, involving the efforts of Solomon Schoenfeld, a British rabbi who had been a primary figure in the Kindertransport that had saved many Jewish children on the eve of the war, and that Ben-Gurion, by the way, opposed. Schoenfeld worked to get the British government to arrange safe passage for Jews who were in Axis territory. I will quote from him. Schoenfeld said, "In view of the massacres and starvation of Jews and others, interestingly, in enemy and enemy-held territories, he gathered support for a motion for the UK, quote, to declare its readiness to find temporary refuge in its own territories or in territories under its control for endangered persons." Now, this is, of course, precisely what the world needed, and inertia for his project grew quickly. By early 1943, Schoenfeld had 177 British MPs ready to support the measure, in addition to archbishops, bishops, peers, and the episcopate of England and Wales. And so, with passage of the rescue effort in sight, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, as we all know is a Zionist organization, assisted from the United States by Stephen Wise, president of the World Jewish Congress, a Zionist organization, intervened and sabotaged it. Now, Wise himself had just held a press conference days earlier in the U.S. Capitol to spread the alarm that the Nazis planned the extermination of European Jews. They all knew about the death camps. But the Zionists sabotaged the rescue project because the fraud of Zionism would have been laid bare for all to see, its narrative evaporated, because the safe haven would not have been in Palestine. Schoenfeld's group tried everything to save the rescue effort, but was admonished, quote, in no uncertain terms, that they, the Board of Deputies, Wise, the Zionist establishment, would do whatever was necessary to squash government support for the rescue. The final tragedy was that in the end, the Zionists created what appeared to be an internecine battle among Jews, questioning the very seriousness and urgency of the horror in Europe. In 1944, U.S. President Roosevelt and his friend Morris Ernst, who would be among the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, arranged for safe haven and new homes for 500,000 DPs, displaced people from the war, more than half of these new homes to be in the United States and Britain. Again, once the plan was headed for success, United States Zionists sabotaged it and accused Ernst of being a, quote, traitor because Ernst was Jewish. Jewish survivors of the war were particular victims. The Jewish Agency got the Allies to segregate Jewish survivors from all others into Zionist camps, and then subjected them, emotionally vulnerable after having just survived the unthinkable, to what can only be described as brainwashing, literally terrorizing them into the Zionist playbook. This was so extreme that when a joint US-UK committee visited the camps in 1946 and asked if they might like to resettle in the United States, which had always been the favorite destination, they responded in utter terror, saying that the United States was so unsafe that they would commit mass suicide if forced to go to the United States. Many Jewish children whose parents had perished were being raised in adoptive European families. And so the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of the Palestine settlements, Rabbi Herzog, ran a kidnapping operation in Europe, forcing the children from their homes, making them orphans for a second time, to ship them to Palestine as ethnic fodder. It's important to point out that Herzog's fiercest opposition came consistently from local Jewish leaders who had the children's interest in mind rather than the interest of Zionism. The kidnappings were rationalized by others at the time on the grounds that, as terrible as it was to tear the children away from their families, it was understandable that Herzog would want them to be in Jewish families rather than Christian families. Now, think what you want of this in theory, but it too was a lie, because the Zionists stopped Jewish orphans from reaching their Jewish adoptive families in England in order to ship them to Palestine as well. Zionism was over everything. Jews were its sacrifices. Jews and Jewish suffering were and remain today Zionism's addiction, its reason to exist. That the Israeli narrative presents Israel and the Zionist movement as the torchbearer of the moral weight of European anti-Jewish persecution and the Holocaust is an obscenity. They are the cynical exploitation of the memory of Hitler's victims, all the more so in that Israel invokes their memory to help it carry on the same crime of racial nationalism. But when we arrive now at November 1947, we discover that we're wrong, that none of today's horror is Israel's fault, because 2 years after the war, the United Nations offered both the Zionists and the Palestinians a state, General Assembly Resolution 181. Israel's founders embraced the offer with gratitude, whereas the Palestinians scoffed at it. In the words of the prominent Zionist watchdog Camera, the, quote, fundamental fact is that had the Palestinians accepted partition, there would have been a Palestinian state since 1948, and there would not have been a single Palestinian refugee. Now, the logic here is, to say the least, specious on the face of it, but let's leave that aside. The idea that the Palestinians rejected the state offered them, whereas the Zionists agreed to it, is widely repeated even in serious history books, and it is used by Israel to paint today's horror as a conflict not of their making. that is the result of circumstances imposed on them, not the result of any Zionist plan. The reality, however, is that within the walls of the UN, the Jewish agency made a clever chess move. They pretended to agree to partition. It was a lie, and everyone involved knew it. In truth, they were fanatically opposed to partition and had been preparing for years to defeat it militarily. They feigned acceptance of partition because it handed them statehood, the single weapon powerful enough to defeat partition, to seize all the land, and to ethnically cleanse it of non-Jews. Statehood was the key to everything. If this were simply my interpretation of the historical record, it would be of limited value for the task at hand. But it is their own explicit, repeatedly stated plans. In the interest of time, I will just summarize by saying that the Zionist determination that there will never be a Palestinian state, that they will take all of Palestine at a minimum, and that they would expel the land's non-Jews was fanatical and unwavering throughout the 3 decades from the end of World War I to Israel's self-declaration of statehood and beyond. It was always the plan and remains so today. Pretenses to the contrary were only for the benefit of the media. But there was one possible glitch to their plans, and that was if the British, or ultimately the United Nations, were to propose a state of all the people, whether a true single state or a binational state, instead of partition. This would make their job vastly more difficult. And indeed, when in the summer of 1947, UNSCOP, the UN committee tasked with proposing a solution to the Palestine problem, when they presented their recommendation, there were 2 proposals: partition or a binational single state. So, presented with both options, why was a state of all its people the loser? The obvious answer, based on history, is actually stated outright in British cabinet papers at the time. The answer is fear of Zionist terrorism. The UN selected partition because they knew that if they didn't, the Zionists would have responded with, quote, an intensification of Jewish terrorism. That is, an intensification of Zionist terror beyond that which had already brought Palestine to its knees and, more to the point for the decision makers, was increasingly threatening Europe. Now, having selected partition in principle, the UN now had to map this partition. So how to explain that their partition gave more than half of the land to the Zionists, who, despite the massive influx of settlers, were still a minority? The answer to that lays to rest any lingering question that the UN knew that Israel would ignore partition, and that the whole exercise was a fraud. Again, quoting the British, the desire for expansion might develop earlier if the Jewish state occupied a smaller area, and would be felt more strongly if the Jews were dissatisfied with the frontiers. So, the UN simply hoped to delay, not prevent, but merely delay Israel's first expansionist war by giving them so much up front. The partition line, in effect, was mapped to include the theoretical fruits of its first expansionist war, saving the UN from the embarrassment of it coming so soon. This appeasement, of course, failed. Israel began its first expansionist war beyond this immediately. And note that it is implicit throughout this that the UN also assumed that its own Security Council would do nothing to stop Israel. Resolution 181, partition, was a scam. Everyone involved with it knew that it was a scam, and above all, the Palestinians knew it was a scam. The Israeli creation myth is found even in serious history books, but it is complete fiction. In the world as it is, statehood is our measure of all things. From the mantle of statehood, the Zionist terrorism became Israeli military actions, whereas for the Palestinians, denied the podium of statehood, their self-defense was now terrorism. The cure for today's apartheid is what should have happened in 1947 to 1948. One secular, democratic state, river to sea. Everyone there now who wants to remain becomes an equal citizen in a shared society. And equality means, by definition, that every refugee has the absolute, individual, unqualified right to return home. Yet this simple idea of equality, which we in the modern West claim to venerate, suddenly becomes controversial, scandalous, even hate speech when it is applied to Israel-Palestine. There's a crime in progress. We have the proof. Indeed, not only do we have the forensic proof, but the crime is going on in full view for the world to see. So, what happens when we point out the obvious, when we report this crime in progress? Well, we are silenced with the smear of anti-Semitism. Now, people refer to this tactic as McCarthyism, but this understates the issue. It is much worse than McCarthyism, because as much as communism was a dirty word in the United States in the 1950s, ultimately, communism is what? It's a political economic theory that one can argue for or against. Anti-Semitism is a smear with no escape. One could say, so what if I am a communist? So what? You can't do the same with anti-Semitism. The lie of some intrinsic connection between the Palestinian cause and anti-Semitism is part of the calculated dehumanization of the Palestinians. For at least a decade, and especially since 2014 and the widespread outrage against Israel for its atrocities against Gaza that summer, the so-called protective edge assault, the major media have, without exception, uncritically been parroting a succession of news stories about ever-increasing anti-Semitism, serving as the megaphone for three Zionist organizations: the Board of Deputies, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which was actually created in response to the bad press after Protective Edge, and the Community Service Trust. Does anyone remember any of these organizations ever announcing, great news, anti-Semitism has declined this quarter? No, it has long become utterly farcical, and yet the media continue to report one new alarm after the other without betraying the slightest curiosity. Already 6 years ago, the Daily Mail reported that, quote, Jews feel as threatened as they did in the Holocaust, experts say. And there has been no let-up since. Methodology and the very criteria they've used for identifying anti-Jewish bigotry are never addressed, and concern for actual anti-Semitism, that of newly emergent neo-fascism, is strangely absent. So let's just blurt it out. This is a two-pronged weapon. Prong one, embed in the public mind the lie of a link between support for Palestinian human rights and anti-Semitism. This is, of course, the specific purpose of the IHRA pseudo-definition. And prong two, keep a never-ending crisis of anti-Semitism in the public mind in order to keep us terrified. We must demand transparency for these statistics, transparency for who is behind the CAA and the CST. They have an exception to keep that confidential. And above all, we must demand an explanation as to what on earth bigotry against Jews has to do with Palestinian human rights. This tactic's greatest power operates unseen as self-censorship, people not speaking up so as not to get attacked by this weapon, universities and other institutions or employers not even offering a position for fear of trouble, organizations not inviting speakers who might offend the Israeli state for fear of trouble. This is the most insidious effect of this weapon because it is the most damaging, the most widespread, and yet it leaves no trace. And so what we do see is a minuscule part of the damage. Academics already hired, such as Norman Finkelstein or David Miller, or most famously, the sabotaging of Jeremy Corbyn. This weapon has been amplified by being a tactic of convenience for anyone against progressive voices, not just Israel's propagandists. Israel supplies the weapon for anyone to use. Politicians who might have no interest in Israel take up the cause because smearing progressive leaders as anti-Semitic requires no evidence and is hugely effective. As an illustration of how quickly and how powerfully Zionism marketed the brand name Israel and its kidnapping of Jewish identity in order to wield the smear of anti-Semitism to defend its crimes, let's go back to 1949, and I turn to none other than Winston Churchill. when after the supposed ceasefire at the end of 1948, Israel was trying to seize yet more territory in Gaza and the Sinai, it continually blocked UN observers from the area. And so in early January 1949, Britain sent small aircraft, Spitfires and Tempests, from Egypt to investigate. Israel shot down 5 British aircraft over non-Israeli territory, killing 2 British pilots. So, what was the reaction of Churchill, the great war hero? In a personal minute not declassified until 2013, Churchill defends Israel and repeatedly smears Ernest Bevin, who had been the foreign secretary, as anti-Semitic for condemning the Israeli attacks against British planes killing British pilots. In the document, Churchill specifically equates the then 7.5-month-old Israeli state with the biblical realm. And he refers to the Israeli aircraft that shot down the British planes and killed his pilots as Israelite airplanes. Even Israel's planes were biblical. The irony doesn't end there. In the same letter, Churchill frets about the, quote, powerful and possibly decisive Jewish vote, especially in New York. Fast forward to 2023 and little has changed. Livelihoods and careers are destroyed on Israel's behalf. U.S. citizens are forced to sign loyalty oaths to the Israeli state. And AIPAC actually brags about their success in swaying U.S. elections to Israel's favor. The militarization of anti-Semitism likely gave us these catastrophic few years of Tory rule rather than Corbyn, who would have been obviously the most categorically non-racist, non-anti-Semitic leader this country would ever have had. So let's go straight to the crux of this construct of the Jewish state. This self-identity requires that the Israeli state preserve what it considers to be blood purity by way of laws forbidding marriage between someone who, according to the state, is Jewish with someone who, according to the state, is not Jewish, and that this select lineage remain the majority, and that all others are legally lesser human beings. Now, herein lies Israel's conundrum. Such race laws and the concept of blood purity should shock us, should revolt us. Yet Israel has no choice in this matter, because without these race laws, Israel by its own self-identity, a definition we have embraced, would cease to exist. If we are going to accept this idea of such a state, can we blame Israel for its ethnic cleansings of 1948 and 1967 and its back burner ethnic cleansing that has been going on all these years through to this moment? No. Can we blame Israel for keeping 6 million human beings in camps because they're not Jewish? No. Can we blame Israel for keeping non-Jews river to sea under apartheid and killing any non-Jewish teenagers showing signs of leadership against their repression? No. Either we agree that this is not only acceptable, but indeed something to be massively funded, massively defended, and that our own freedoms should be curtailed on its behalf, or we have to say that the Zionist state as such must end. And we must not be afraid to say so. The idea of a racially predicated state is not a condition of Israel that can be legislated away with tweaks to its system. It's the very premise of the state itself. Now, we are often challenged about Israel's right to exist, but this is nonsense. No state has the intrinsic right to exist. People have the right to exist. States are social, political, economic, legal structures invented by people to serve them and that exist at their pleasure. Israel does not exist with the consent of the vast majority of the people whose lives it controls. And to be sure, Israel is not the only such state. Everyone there now, everyone, river to sea, plus all the refugees, they have the intrinsic right to exist on that land as equals. No one should be frightened by this. South Africa is a different state than it was 50 years ago. It is not a different people. No one got hurt when the old South Africa was replaced with a state of all its people. Understandably, in the fight for justice in Palestine, we focus on Israel's actions, which we should, of course, but it's not enough. We need also to expose the actual problem, a state based on Zionism. Until we do that, we will always be just condemning Israel's crimes. When we fought against apartheid in South Africa, we didn't just condemn the state's violence, we opposed the race state itself. But in order to free Palestine from Israel, we need first to free ourselves from Israel, to stand up to the Israeli state's occupation of us. This means that when narrative, masquerading as history, is thrown at us, or when propaganda about what is happening now is thrown at us, and above all, when the smear of anti-Semitism is unjustly thrown at us, we don't respond within the context of this diversion. We need to respond by turning the tables. Now, if we had just come down from a 200-year hermitage on a mountaintop, knowing nothing of the conflict, and looked at it with fresh eyes, and we heard the smears, we would respond in disbelief. We would say, now hold on here, there's something very strange going on, because there is indeed anti-Semitism here, but it's coming from the accusers, not the accused. Do not respond with protestations of your innocence. Do not respond with any form of apology for anything you didn't do, thinking you will placate the inquisitors. These responses only play into the inquisitors' hands and are exploited to expand their assault. Jeremy Corbyn, who should have known better, is a tragic case in point. The smear is to silence you, of course, but they're also thrilled if you protest, to keep you on the defensive about anti-Semitism. They're thrilled because anti-Semitism remains the issue and because the words Palestine, the word apartheid, the term ethnic cleansing are nowhere to be found. Everyone should always expose, condemn all bigotry, no matter the victim. But those of us fighting for freedom for Palestine have been put in the position of feeling we need to condemn anti-Jewish bigotry in particular, as if we had some original sin on the matter. No, we condemn it as human beings, as we condemn all bigotry, not because that particular bigotry has anything special to do with us. The idea that it does is a Zionist construct, part of its dehumanization of the Palestinians, and we shouldn't play along with it. So, in my view, and I feel quite strongly that I am correct in this, when the inevitable scarlet letter is scrawled on your chest, your response should throw the charge back, and it must include the words that the smear was intended to silence. For example, you might respond, no, do not insult Jewish identity to cover up the Israeli state's crimes of apartheid against non-Jews in Israel or Palestine. Or you might say, wait, I am arguing for simple human rights. You are smearing Jews as opposing these? Or you might say, there's no apartheid in Israel? Great. Then you agree that the actual living human beings whom Israel expelled for not being Jewish have the same right to return as people who have never set foot in the land. Or you might say, no, the anti-Semitism here is from those defending Israeli apartheid in the name of Jews. We often hear that a Palestinian did not receive a permit from Israel to do something, such as to repair their house or to travel to the hospital, to a church, a mosque, a funeral, whatever. Permission is a propaganda term stealing the terms of debate. Israel has no such authority over the lives of the Palestinians. What is actually happening is that Israel is forcibly blocking someone from getting cancer treatment, whatever, because they are not Jewish. The word permits is used to hide that, and we should never accept it in our responses. Similarly, the media unfailingly report the various situations in East Jerusalem, such as the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah, the attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, etc., couched in context of Israeli law. But East Jerusalem is not in Israel. Yet the media invoke Israeli laws and court decisions as though they had any relevancy. We must break the cycle. Our responses should reject the laws of that invading power. There is one final type of decoy issue designed to keep us sidetracked by nonsense that I think is important enough to mention. And that is arguments about what happened 2,000 or 3,000 years ago in the region. Even to consider this an issue meriting discussion is to accept that Israel's messianic pretenses are a valid argument. Or similarly, Israel's propagandists have us arguing about the origin of the term Palestine. They say the term was invented by the Romans to deny Jewish identity to the land. We argue back that no, it preceded that. What does this have to do with the human rights of Palestinians today? If the Romans really did invent the term, as the Zionists say, oh well, then the ethnic cleansing is justified? Or the invocation of the term Semitic people. Oh, but we argue that the Palestinians are also Semitic. Meaning what? That if we couldn't call them Semitic, then apartheid would be okay? Don't fall for this. All this sort of thing is a tactic to keep us distracted. Ignore these decoys and speak of apartheid and ethnic cleansing against the region's non-Jews. And when you are rebuked with the term the Jewish state, demand the user explain what it is they mean by it and push them. Don't let them pass it off as somehow analogous to a state with a state religion. When we refuse to be corralled into Israel's terms of debate, we will elicit outrage and disbelief at first, but there will be a tipping point when the soundness of our argument will stand on its own, the abuses and anti-Semitism of the Zionists becomes inescapable, people will lose their fear of speaking up, and suddenly all our politicians will all be claiming that they were against Zionism all along. A century from now, PhD candidates will stake their careers trying to crack a problem that stymied their professors. How the charade of Zionism lasted so long. Thank you.